And without further ado, I think we'll just jump right into it and welcome Scott Moore onto the stage. Scott, feel free to unmute and share your video. And yeah, really excited to hear a little bit more about how Ethereum has been kind of building itself into a public good. Yeah, just all the kind of crazy solar punk crypto outcomes of that. So Scott, when you're ready, feel free to share your video and I'll get the screen share out of here. There you are. Hey, Scott, how's it going?
Hey, going well. Can you see the screen here? Does this look okay?
Yeah, everything's great. And I love the art.
Awesome.
So I'll get out of the way and we're excited for your chat.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate you having me on. I actually have given like a kind of similar version of this talk, and I kind of yielded into this a little bit, but I think the real kind of interesting thing that occurred to me to like kind of talk about in the last few months was, you know, we do have this whole conversation going on about like solar punk and other X punks. And I think there's something interesting to be said just about kind of abstracting away from that and just talking about Ethereum itself as a public good. And so what I wanted to do with this talk is give a bit of context on like, what is this sort of like Plato's cave that we're in around like these different narratives around, you know, solar punk and so forth. How do we, you know, kind of go beyond that towards the core mission that Ethereum is driving? And then how do we talk about, in particular, the ways that Ethereum is kind of allowing us to reimagine what we mean by public goods in the context of Web3, but also just generally, you know, in the context of open source software. And so to start, maybe the easiest thing to do is just to talk about like, what are these different kind of narratives that we've been seeing in the space over the last probably 6 to 12 months. And I think a lot of this stems actually from cyberpunk roots, like back from sort of the Neuromancer era and like the 1980s, even like a little bit before that, which was largely the starting point for cypherpunk, which kind of advocates for strong cryptography, very like intense privacy preserving technologies. John Perry Barlow is probably like one of the most famous members of this movement, and really with the Cyberpunk Manifesto sort of like gave a probably the most compelling and most detailed case for this movement. But ultimately what we've sort of landed on is an evolution of that, which tries to take sort of the individualist notion of cypherpunk and frame it in more of a collective collaborative way. So the goal of this sort of solar punk ethos, which started back in sort of 2008, was originally really, well, how do we build environmentalism into our sort of like notion of like, you know, tech as a force for good? And how do we find more ways to build a sort of open future where technology facilitates better global sort of coordination? And in Web3, that just seemed to make a lot of sense as a philosophy where, you know, everything we're doing is kind of revolving around coordination. It's all coordination in some sense. And, you know, creating sustainable, convivial, kind of like pro-social connection is something, especially in the DAO space more recently in the last 6 months, that's become very popular to sort of not just talk about, but actually I think take action on. So even beyond Gitcoin, which is mostly where I spend my time, I co-founded that back in 2017. There's lots of projects in the DAO space that are really focused on trying to have more intentional conversations about, you know, the values that we're creating in Web3, in Ethereum in particular, and how we're basically trying to create this connection between people and their environments, whether those are sort of digital spaces where sometimes there's a lot of noise and we want to kind of create a sense of peace, or actually just the physical environment we're in and how we make sure the technology is, you know, facilitating that connection. And obviously, most recently, the merge has been a really big part of that conversation. So I think those are like kind of two, not opposing forces, but like juxtaposed like ideas of what the space is trying to achieve. And I think there's people on kind of both sides of those. And that's what's led to sort of the emergence of lunar punk as a critique of principally the openness of solar punk, the kind of like optimism of solar punk, you know, and it's sort of like failure to really imagine a future in which privacy is front and center, especially in the face of like a lot of real risks if, you know, there is too much openness and transparency, which principally is the risk to a lot of more marginalized populations, folks that, you know, we are trying to make a positive impact for. And so really, you know, it kind of emphasizes privacy and collective action and, you know, still giving people individual agency rather than kind of like, you know, making everyone part of this egregore that, you know, subsumes everything before it. And so it kind of advocates for a more realist approach to the sort of like political landscape, which really is like, goes back to full circle, the sort of cypherpunk movement, John Perry Barlow's ideas. And I think we've kind of gotten to this point where the reason I kind of started with the idea that, these are really interesting ideas, but like maybe not the most useful framings, is I think what we've sort of realized is that we're all kind of, to some degree, although this term is a bit controversial in other circles, like techno-optimist. I think everyone here believes that technology can have a fundamentally positive impact on the way that we work together in the long run. And I think that, regardless of approach, if we can build technology that, leads to some collective human thriving, then we should try and do that. And we can do that in a way that kind of, I think, fulfills each of these like narratives without actually creating any sense of conflict. And so I think what's really important for us is to think about then, why is Ethereum part of this techno-optimist movement? And how do we think about these sorts of framings as, kind of like a relevant part of the Ethereum ecosystem, a relevant part of the Ethereum narrative? And I think kind of the juxtaposition right now in a lot of broader tech is between the kind of accelerationist AI sort of like growth at all costs, relatively algorithmic way of thinking about growth and about technology and about techno-optimism. And I think Ethereum fundamentally presents a little bit more of like an agentic, like agent-based form of that, in which we can think more deeply about the way that, we push back on existing social structures or political structures as the only means of coordination, the way in which we kind of push back on large like companies or, kind of large kind of capital like based actors for economic coordination. And then the way that we sort of can reverse these trends towards institutional power. All these are social things. They're, based on us as agents, as people, not necessarily algorithmic things. And I think that's like what's really kind of fascinating about Ethereum, and what's really interesting about this sort of particular flavor of techno-optimism that we can try and achieve regardless of the particular implementation details. So I think the fundamental part of Ethereum being a sort of public good comes back to this sort of techno-optimism, the notion that, by building better technology together, we can create this kind of future that we want to see and move beyond this baggage of like previous institutions. And I think, there's actually some really interesting stuff that I'll talk about in a minute about like how that actually reframes our notion of public goods altogether. So, I kind of talked about this, but basically we're scaling coordination. That's what we're doing. We're doing that in a sort of person by person relationship based way. We're trying to figure out ways to coordinate as people at scale, even, regardless of our own sort of like opinions about the world or our own belief systems, or even our own, kind of broader objectives, things we're trying to achieve in the world. We can kind of work together in a pluralistic way to achieve what we want to achieve. And I think what's interesting about the traditional ways of looking at scaling systems is that you kind of, as you build a really massive, like Dunbar's number kind of talks about this 150 numbers of like scale, but really we're talking about systems of like tens of thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands or millions even. When you get to that scale, it's very hard for people to relate to each other, to feel a sense of solidarity, to like build in a values aligned way. But it is very possible for us to build systems that allow those relationships to grow large enough, to grow carefully enough that, and with enough kind of background technology that we don't lose the sort of underlying structure of the agreements that we've created together, these sort of like shared agreements with each other. And I think this is sort of like the fundamental conceit of like the coordination meme, is that what we mean by coordination is coming to shared agreements with each other in kind of a scaled up way, and doing that towards like effectively sometimes very different ends. But ultimately, I think finding ways to basically scale coordination is at the heart of Ethereum, and kind of to me at the heart of this, like what Ethereum has to offer in a techno-optimist like context. It's, not going and building kind of like, exponentially increasing AI that kind of like subsumes, similar to the sort of egregore example, like everything around it. It's about building, and whether that's true is a whole conversation in itself. But it's about building kind of systems that allow us to work with each other over time. I think it's very hard to overemphasize how hard a problem that is. And I won't go into like a lot of depth here, but I think this is like really the fundamental piece of what we're trying to achieve, and why I think, it's going to be so important for us to kind of like think carefully about the narratives that we're putting forward, and basically how even across narratives we like are able to build systems that allow us to work together. And in that sense, it's kind of like, Ethereum, this is the other sort of techno-optimist angle of this, is our alternative to doomerism. We sort of have this pervasive notion and broader society, Web3, I think to some extent, maybe in the last few months as well, where we think, oh, like, everything's going to fail. It's like we're doomed to the systems that we've created for ourselves and to like the problems we face as people. I think that's fundamentally misguided. And I think that it kind of fails to recognize what we've already achieved with sort of Ethereum as a technology, in the ways that we've taken agency and ownership back over sort of existing institutions. Still other fights to come, obviously, with, for example, the Tornado Cash situation that emerged and many others in that sort of vein. But we can sort of also, use these coordination tools to fight for those causes and to fight for other causes we believe in. We can mint our own cooperative currencies in order to kind of work within the constraints we have and find capital needed to fund those efforts. And then we can design incentive mechanisms to keep people working on those things long term. And I think this is very much the heart of coordination. All these things is what we sort of mean by coordination at scale. But it's also fundamentally what makes this whole enterprise like techno-optimist. And I think it's sort of this sense that, we are together in a sort of bottoms-up collective way, not top-down collective or bottoms-up individual way, going to take back agency and sort of control over the systems that we have kind of like let run loose in the world. And so, okay, like the whole point of this talk is public goods. Why is Ethereum a public good? What do we mean when we talk about public goods? What are we actually talking about? So a lot of the narratives before are kind of around the idea that we have sort of a lot of confusion about what it is that we're trying to achieve at the narrative level. We have a lot of sort of progress that we made in terms of like tangible ways to improve coordination. Techno-optimism helps us kind of like promote that as like a very good thing to do in an agentic sort of like person-to-person way. And in turn, we actually now have these like funding mechanisms and so forth that we can use, which I'll get to. And we've, with Gitcoin, tried to do this as a core part of our mission. But what are these things that we're actually funding? And when we're funding things in Ethereum and funding this coordination tool, why is that a public good? So traditionally, the notion of public goods comes back to this sort of Paul Samuelson 1954 sort of paper around non-excludability, non-rivalry. Things that are public goods are things that can't be excluded. No one can be excluded from them, or they're non-rivalrous. One person's access to this good does not restrict another person's access. And one of the interesting things about that framing is that it kind of was born out of almost the sort of idea that these public goods of sorts were sort of aspirational. They were sort of pipe dreams. And if they could be funded, they could be funded in mostly a top-down collective fashion by traditional states or state actors. And I think the major kind of problem with that is being that like it didn't allow us to think big enough about what we actually wanted to achieve. And it kind of was partly, I think, how we ended up with institutions that ran amok in ways that we didn't necessarily, intend them to do. And so, there's a lot of nuance to the way that we reframe public goods, but I think one very simple frame is the things that we want to see in the world are things that produce positive externalities for a broader group than the initial people involved in the process of maintaining that good. And the traditional example of this, like an electrical grid in like a city, transportation network, they have lots of really interesting kind of positive externalities that we can think about. So one, in the transportation case, property value goes up every time a new subway station is created in, say, New York City. There's lots of people that want to like kind of go towards that. And there's now an externality for other people around that specific local area. Same with electrical grids. If you have an electrical grid, you have like people that can now be part of the community, be part of the city, and that's very good for everyone. The probably less like local example, which we've started to see really emerge in conversation in Web3 with learning communities, is the notion of like a university. And that's sort of where I think things like kernel or things like emerging sort of like groups like Forefront or like MetaLabel and so forth are really starting to explore some interesting territory with the work that they're doing. Seed Club. There's a lot of communities like clubs that are basically technically private. Like technically you can't just go and learn at the university, but clearly, and they cost money to be part of. You can't just access it with zero capital through, but like you can actually still produce massive social gains via these institutions. And of course, that's why in the traditional world, like universities are funded by the state, funded as a public good in that sense. But I think what we're sort of forgetting in this way of thinking about so right now we've kind of created like, you've got like electrical grids, transportation, universities. These are all things that are fundamentally, like from most people's conception, public goods, despite this kind of dissonance around, well, wait, I have to pay for this. What are we like? How are we really considering that non-excludable, non-rivalrous? And you can see how that might create issues in the definition. But there's more interesting examples that I think start to create even more confusion for us than those. And I think open source software is sort of like one of these where I think there's certain things like, say, the library that we all use to build Web3 applications, something like Ethers.js, and something like Uniswap, which I think recoil at the idea of as a public good. And I think that's because there's this distinction between the token holder and the broader community. And we sort of have this notion that there's an in-group and an out-group. And if you're not in the token holder community, you're suddenly, at odds with the rest of the community, or they're at odds with you. And I think fundamentally, this is where the notion of positive externalities becomes very useful. The greater the network grows, the more not only the token holders benefit, but anyone who just happens to use in day-to-day interaction the protocol itself also benefits. And so in this sense, there's a little bit of a difference between the sort of traditional way of thinking about public goods and the way that Ethereum kind of redefines those to be about these positive externalities, especially in the face of existing fees, possible restrictions to use, and especially in the face of like different classes of members, people that are or are not token holders, people that are or are not delegates, people that are or are not core team members. And I think this is something that is still fundamentally important for us to wrestle with and explore as we think about what we're building on Ethereum and we're thinking about Ethereum making impact. We need to be thinking about basically, what is that boundary point that we think is acceptable? And I guess my case here today is that we're actually, a lot of these things that we are debating about sometimes, on twitter.com or whatever it might be, as being, oh, they're not really public, they're not really, they don't meet this criteria, they don't meet this like strict definition. I would argue that in many cases, those are things that we fundamentally all benefit from in a way that approximates something that we would like to call a public good, even if it's not the traditional way that we define it. And so in that sense, I think funding more of those things, I think building more of those things, I think finding ways to help people understand and educate people about more of those things is itself a public good. And it is something that actually is fundamentally in line with the sort of agentic techno-optimist vision that I think we all want to start to push forward, as sort of Ethereans in this network. And so fundamentally, we have a few examples of this that I think we're all sort of familiar with, but that I think are worth looking at, that we should be supporting in some form or another. Admittedly, I may be biased towards some of these. I think that, portable, especially private identity, like ENS with something like Seismo, which allows for that sort of privacy. I think that sort of form of identity is a really cool, like an important primitive for us to be able to, for example, solve subword systems, ensure that we have some pseudonymous identities that we can all sort of interact with each other through, so that we can kind of move beyond this amorphous sort of like dark forest into something that's a little bit more visible, while still giving people the option to keep privacy, especially when they are at risk of, serious retaliation from, for example, state actors. I think this is where solarpunk ultimately kind of like in the extreme gets it wrong, which is that like, yes, we want techno optimism, but we need techno optimism in a way that allows for people to consider privacy good and to consider privacy as a fundamental human right. And that's like, I think just a really cool application that obviously ENS has done an amazing job with, and many others are starting to really explore deeply. And I think there's a reason it's being like a really important topic for Ethereum, just because we, I think, haven't had this sort of portable layer for our own like lives on the internet, despite the fact that we use the internet probably more than once a day. I think it'd be very unlikely to find a lot of people who use it exactly once or less than once a day. I think that like there's a lot of these examples and I could go through them for a long time, but I also recognize that I have a limited amount of time. So I'll kind of just go through these pretty quickly for the remainder. But basically we've got decentralized storage. The DWeb principles are kind of like part of what Filecoin and IPFS have contributed to in terms of how are we thinking about creating systems that really prioritize user agency and decentralization and so forth. In general, I just think having decentralized storage kind of fits in with this need that we're talking about to have fundamentally like distributed kind of global coordination systems. And I think that the more centralized you get, the more you run this risk of basically capture the network in a way that isn't shared with the users, shared with the broader community. And I think that's one of the reasons this sort of positive externalities framing for public goods works in Web3 much better than it did in previous iterations, which is that like for each of these actually, but especially for like these kind of core identity storage primitives, having the infrastructure that you're building be shared, even if not everyone is owning that, like a portion of that infrastructure, equally as in a co-op, for example, I think it's very important for the long-term sort of like sustainability of Web3 for Ethereum, and is like kind of the core, part of what we're building here. The other two kind of components I think are a little bit higher up the stack. It's basically, things like optimisms, retroactive public goods funding, quadratic funding. Those are ways to help us in a grassroots way signal and basically fund things that we care about. I think this is really important because traditionally, again, like what is the reason that this sort of like state funding as like the only mechanism for public goods became so prominent? Well, because it's very easy to kind of like collect and like aggregate value and then kind of put that out into the world in a sustainable way if you're a government. But it's very hard to do that at a grassroots level, and especially hard to do it in a way where you feel like your voice is being heard. So having some ability for people to locally sort of signal what they care about and then to be able to aggregate those things into a kind of preference map is really important. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a second. And then modular governance tooling, which I think is just very important for any of these structures, these DAOs, these tools that like basically are allowing for kind of the creation of public goods on Ethereum. This modular tooling is important for that to take shape. So basically, the thing that I'm focused on a lot day to day is things like this idea of collective sort of intelligence, collective decision making via things like quadratic funding. What quadratic funding basically means, I think everyone kind of knows at this point, is just that you're trying to essentially fund a large group of projects in a given area based on local individual preferences. And then basically philanthropic funds are matched according to that preference map. And the reason this is important is, again, in the state case, you don't really have the ability to really have a lot of say. There's not really actually, despite kind of a lot of academic conversations on this, a lot of participatory budgeting that happens in practice. But this is kind of a Web3 form of that participatory budgeting where we can actually take the action that we want to see in the world and know that it will be listened to by a broader group of philanthropists or folks that are helping to fund the ecosystem at large. And I think this is a really important kind of like example of what will be a much broader design space around the coordination of funding in the future. And I think that, like, again, there's this really interesting conversation about, like, to what degree do we kind of rely on like collective intelligence? To what degree do we rely on experts? To what degree do we rely on like AI as the ultimate expert, as like this like kind of meta expert? And I think there's a real conversation to be had about like how much should we let go of our own sort of like capacity for decision making. And there's trade-offs there, of course. Like, certainly experts are better for some decisions than others, but I think it's really, that's like a fundamental question that we're going to have to grapple with. And I think Ethereum is like a really great kind of showing point for having conversations around those tools in context. So in the end, I hope that by creating all these kinds of DAOs, by creating all these sort of like different ecosystems that are, creating their own local impact, creating positive externalities in the process, we're able to basically create a kind of impact network. And David Ehrlichman has talked a lot about this. He wrote a book on it called Impact Networks, I believe. And it's a very interesting idea in the sense that I think there wasn't really, the cypherpunks had this notion of we're all going to independently build our own tooling, work independently, and solve for, we're going to fight the state through our own like kind of heroic action. I think the solar punks have the notion that we can do this like collectively and work with the state and be kind of like, a happy family. I think the lunar punks are kind of like trying to be more realistic about those things. But I think regardless of those different narratives, the idea that we can actually form impact networks locally together with some kind of broader, and coordination that's achieved, again, like as a result, I think that's ultimately where a lot of this is going, and where the benefit of Ethereum, the impact of Ethereum comes in. So hopefully that kind of got most of the points across here. I think I'm out of time. So all I'll say is Ethereum, I think, is a public good. I think the notion of public goods needs to evolve from where it is today. And I think that if we find ways to evolve that definition, we can coordinate towards a more techno-optimist future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was awesome. Maybe a quick question, just before you go. Like, if anybody wants to start like actively participating in, being a part of this kind of public goods movement using Ethereum, like, where's a good place for them to start doing that right now?
I'm definitely biased towards, Gitcoin as a place to do it. I think, going to the Gitcoin Discord and just getting involved. Optimism as well is just starting up, and they have lots of initial grants. I think, honestly, at this point, there's no real shortage of places to make an impact. And I think it's a question just of what kind of impact do you want to make? Find the thing. This is like everyone gives this advice, but like, find the thing that you're passionate about, right? And leverage that passion and find ways to, basically work with a group that needs that skill set. And kind of, a lot of the original challenges of this with DAOs was you kind of tried to do that. And I think there wasn't really a good process for onboarding and getting people involved. But I think that as people have started to realize, hey, you need structured leadership in DAOs, I think that's started to change. And so I think that people going to DAOs now, certainly relative to like a year ago, will have like a better experience kind of like finding the path in, finding the way to get involved. And I would say like, any of those organizations I mentioned are really good starting points. ENS as well, Filecoin, Protocol Labs as well is doing really good work in this area. Feel free to reach out if you have questions about orgs to get involved in, and I'm sure I can find one.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. Really great having you here, Scott. And I mean, congratulations also on, you're chatting about coordination and how hard that is. Almost 40,000 people donating in the last Gitcoin round that just closed yesterday. That's like a crazy amount of people. So congrats on the success on Gitcoin round 15.